of the U.S.'s top trading partners and trillions of dollars. That and more could all be lost. That's as the Chinese regime has grown ever more aggressive in the waters of the Indo-Pacific. In this special report, we look at why this area is crucial for not just America, but the world. What happens if the Indo-Pacific is no longer free, and how the U.S. seems to have lost sight of the ball. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Waterways where trillions of dollars in trade wash through have been taken for granted. But what happens when those waterways are no longer free?
You have a dynamic where you can't move without Chinese permission. I mean, this is the Middle Kingdom fantasy, right? This is the Chinese Communist Party trying to recreate this fantasy vision of a Chinese past where all of the major decisions refer back to the capital, back to the imperial seat.
That's Cleo Paskal, senior fellow with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Now, why is the Chinese regime going after the area? For one, there's a lot of money involved. The White House noted that two-way trade between the United States and the Indo-Pacific totaled $1.75 trillion in 2020, and it supports more than 5 million jobs in the region. And Secretary of State Antony Blinken notes that the Indo-Pacific is the destination for nearly 1/3 of U.S. exports. But not all players want to play by the rules. One nation has grown ever more aggressive in the region, thwarting international laws.
The People's Republic of China is looking at moving its whole sphere of influence further and further south so that it can get control of resources, key resources. And you've got that happening in Myanmar, in Indonesia, in Papua New Guinea, and in the Solomons, as well as other islands in the South Pacific.
Greg Copley, president of the International Strategic Studies Association, explains that this isn't a new concept. Rather, the Chinese regime is taking a look at the history books.
The Japanese, of course, sought to control the Solomons in World War II, and it was the scene of enormous amounts of very hard fighting by the US Marines going up in the island hopping chain as they went northwards to Japan. But it was also literally the anchor point for the Battle of the Coral Sea, which arguably was the turning point in the war in the Pacific in World War II, leading up to the Battle of Midway, of course, which was another milestone in that campaign against the Japanese expansion.
And as to why the Solomon Islands are so important?
Key undersea communications cables all confluence just near the Solomon Islands. So control of the Solomon Islands would give you access to, or at least influence over, a lot of the undersea cables which are critical to the global information linkages, including the internet, of course. But more than that, the Solomon Islands, as in World War II, are literally astride the access sea lanes to Australia from the North Pacific and from the Eastern Pacific. So really, if you control the Solomons, you can control a lot.
And in recent years, we've been seeing movement in that area.
China's expansion is currently primarily maritime. So you can see it in the way that they're building up the Navy. The PLA Navy is expanding at a rate that we've never seen a peacetime Navy expand before. It's launching ships at a rate of 7-to-1 in comparison to the U.S. in the last 4 years, from 2016 to 2020, the dates we have numbers for. It launched more ships than the entire Japanese surface fleet. So clearly, for China, the Navy is incredibly important.
But it's not just military. Paskal also points out how China's dual civil fusion program is involved.
You're seeing it physically in the Indo-Pacific. We see the physical installations, the shops, the ports, the fishing fleets, because remember, due to the concept of civil military fusion, things like the fishing fleets are very much a part of the state. the ferries, all that sort of stuff. They're part of this naval expansion. That's what you can see.
Under that program, civilian R&D, industry, and other resources can all be rerouted to advance the Chinese military, with the goal being to push those military forces to become the most technologically advanced in the world. On the flip side, we've been seeing alliances pop up in the region. The Quad alliance between Australia, India, Japan, and the United States is one of them. The other is Washington's push for a free and open Indo-Pacific. But Paskal points out the key purpose of those agreements.
What needs to be understood is what's happening in terms of the Quad and in terms of free and open Indo-Pacific, those sorts of things, is in response to China. So we had a free and open Indo-Pacific. We had freedom of navigation. We had rule of law by and large. And then it was disrupted by this Chinese expansion into the region.
But lately, what's really pushed countries in the region to take action is Beijing's new security pact with the Solomon Islands. To begin with, what is so concerning about the deal? Dr. Malcolm Davis, Senior Analyst in Defense Strategy and Capability at ASPA in Canberra, Australia, explains.
Solomon Islands geographically is positioned such that a Chinese military base there would allow China to essentially sever the sea lines of communication, essentially the maritime trade routes between Australia and the United States. And of course, once they have a base in the Solomon Islands, then they can use that as a jumping off point for expanding their influence through the South Pacific further. So for all these reasons, it's a really concerning situation, and it's fundamentally changed our security environment for the worse.
And as a result, there's a lot more activity in the area.
Now with this security agreement with the Solomon Islands, with the talk about basing even on the west coast of Africa, there is a huge, huge concern that this is getting to a point where it will be very difficult to recreate the sort of freedoms that we used to have not that long ago. So in that context, you're seeing a lot of alliances being formed, partnerships being formed at the economic level, which is the initial entry point for China generally before it develops a strategic foothold, and then also at the strategic level and the military level. So we're starting to see concerns across the region about how China is behaving, and it's forcing a level of response that we haven't seen before.
The Quad summit is set to be held in Tokyo towards the end of May. That's unless Australia's general elections right before it don't add pushback.
It'll be 3 days after the Australian election. So that'll be a very telling which leader ends up going, because both leaders have said, both the leaders of both parties up for election are talking about the Solomon Islands and about how it's a critical issue, but they have different pathways towards resolving it.
The Quad leaders held a virtual meeting at the beginning of March, expressing concerns over what's happening in Ukraine. Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison said at the time that the alliances cannot allow what is happening in Ukraine now to ever happen in the Indo-Pacific. Indian Prime Minister Modi underlined that the Quad must remain focused on its core objective of promoting peace, stability, and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific region. Now, as for the in-person meeting coming up at the end of May, Paskal notes what could go down.
Ideally, what you get is overlapping approaches. So the Indian approach might be economic, the U.S. might be whole of society. Ideally, the Australians would broaden out and offer more than just dealing with the government, the Sugavari government, and a learning from each other and an adaptation from each other. They're very important, these meetings, because you can talk to each other and say quietly, not in the press, we don't think your approach is working. This is what we did, for example, in the Maldives or in the Seychelles. And I think this is what you can do here. If you don't want to do it, that's fine. This is what we're going to do. Don't get worried about it. If we're doing it for the sake of the security of a free and open Indo-Pacific. So they're very important meetings.
But even as the U.S. and allies move to counter the Chinese regime's growing assertiveness, the regime is pushing right back. That's all for today's China in Focus on YouTube. We're now sharing a shortened version of our program here after being demonetized for more than a year. Here's what's coming up in our second half. The Chinese regime is building its own game plan to counter Western alliances. It involves areas that right now Washington considers separate issues. We look at what those areas are and what it means going forward. Our full episode can be watched on our partner platform, Epoch TV. To sign up for a free 14-day trial, please click the link down below. Thanks for watching China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer, and see you tomorrow.
Every once in a while, something comes along so masterful, it leaves you in awe. So inspiring, it changes your life. So beautiful, you wish it would never end. When that happens, it's something not to be missed. Shen Yun, an all-new production every year.
The performance was enchanting.
I feel better about the world. I feel uplifted.
It touches you. It really does.
The expertise of the dancers was really, really strong.
To know that it was live music was really fantastic.
We didn't want to miss this.
Make sure you see it.
Have to come. Life-changing.